Hey everyone, welcome back to another Sunday afternoon Bible study together. Trust you're doing well and having a good week. We are going to jump right into our Bible study this week. Again, we are continuing the series entitled Behold Your God, the Way to Majesty. It is a book that I have been going through. It is written by John Snyder, and if you would like, again, you can get this book yourself and follow along with. You'll go a lot more in depth. There are every week that there's a new attribute, and you do 5 days on each attribute. So we're doing kind of 2 weeks per attribute. So I'm taking 5 lessons and condensing them down into 2. So if you'd like to get really the full spectrum of this, I would encourage you to get the book and go through it on your own, and then you'll be that much more prepared to dig in and study along and follow along as we go through this together. So last week we started our study on the incomprehensibility of God. And so if you missed that last week, you can certainly go back. It's recorded on our YouTube channel. Go back and watch that and get all caught up, and then come back and finish watching this, because we're going to finish the idea of God's incomprehensibility today. So let's go ahead and dive right in. What do we mean here? Well, first of all, as we continue going on in this study, we're going to talk about the self-existence and the independence of God. He alone, God alone, is the uncaused cause of everything. He himself is absolutely independent of all else. Therefore, he needs no one outside of himself for his existence and maintenance. We call this the self-existence and independence of God. Another quote here by Matthew Henry: "The greatest and best man in the world must say, 'By the grace of God I am what I am,' but God says absolutely, and it is more than any creature, man or angel, can say, 'I am that I am.' Being self-existent, he cannot be self-sufficient, and therefore all-sufficient." So, when we're talking about God's self-existence and his independence, there are certain creature words that we can never apply to God. If we think of someone who has an origin or a beginning, we're not thinking about God. If we think of someone who has a source or a cause, we're not thinking of God. If we think of someone who has a need or has a lack, we are not thinking about God. And the Bible supports this. And we want to look at some of the biblical evidence for God's, first of all, for his self-existence. So, Psalm 36 and verse 9, we read, "For with you is the fountain of life. In your light do we see life." In God is the fountain of life, the source of life. He is that source. No one is that source for him. He alone is the source of life. John 1, 3 and 4, "All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men." Answers one of the 2 most profound questions can be answered in these 2 verses. Where did matter come from? All things were made through him. And where did life come from? Life came from him. In him alone. He is self-existent. He is the source of all life. What about John 5:26? "For as the Father has life in himself, so he has granted the Son also to have life in himself." God has life in himself. Acts 17:25. "Nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything." God is not merely immortal. He alone possesses life, and he is the source of it. God owes his existence to no one. He is the source of his being. He alone is in this perfection because all other beings owe their existence to his activity. His attributes are also self-existing. All of his attributes have their source in him, and not one has been given to him by another. So we can continue to read in the Bible, Psalm 62. "Once God has spoken, twice have I heard this, that power belongs to God, and that to you, O Lord, belongs steadfast love, for you will render to a man according to his work." Interestingly, here, both God's power and God's steadfast love are essentially God's. They find their source in God. He doesn't receive them from anyone else. They don't originate with another cause. They are fully in God. What about this text, Romans 11:33? Oh, the depth of the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments and how inscrutable his ways. For who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has been his counselor, or who has given a gift to him that he might be repaid? Using a rhetorical question, Paul reminds his readers that God possesses knowledge, and he didn't receive it from anyone. God doesn't need to receive knowledge from anyone because he possesses it in himself. He is self-existent. Life flows from his self. All of his attributes find their source in him. He needs no other. Wow, that's pretty hard to comprehend. Nobody else is like that. Only God is like that. Not only is he self-existent, but we also want to look at the biblical evidence to his independence. His independence. Now, what do we mean by independence? The independence of God means that he alone is the source of his being and of his continued existence. What he is, he will always be without the aid of any created thing. All that is not God, all created things and persons are depending upon God for their continuance. God alone is self-sufficient. He is dependent upon no one. He is independent of anything else. We, exactly the opposite, are fully dependent on him for our continued existence. Psalm 36 and verse 6 says, "Your righteousness is like the highest mountains, your judgment like the deepest sea. Lord, you preserve man and beast." God preserves us. Without that preservation, we would be nothing. Hebrews 1:3. He, that is Jesus Christ, is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature. And we could stop and just dwell on that, and we will one day, just not today. Keep going. And he upholds the universe by the word of his power. Upholds the universe by the word of his power. He is independent. He needs nothing for the continuance of his existence, yet we are upheld. If Jesus ceased to hold us together, we would just dissolve and fly apart on a molecular level. Our very existence is dependent on God and on his power, but he needs no one to perpetuate his existence. He's independent. Colossians 1:17, and he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Or we could read Psalm 104. We read of God sustaining all life on earth in Psalm 104. After listing specific ways in which God upholds all creatures, the psalmist concludes like this: "These all look to you to give them their food in due season. When you give it to them, they gather it up. When you open your hand, they are filled with good things. When you hide your face, they are dismayed. When you take away their breath, they die and return to their dust. When you send forth your spirit, they are created, and you renew the face of the ground." So God clearly reveals himself to be the one who upholds all things. He is not upheld by anything or anyone. Imagine, in a simple way, we could explain it with this illustration. Imagine God holding all things in his hand. In Isaiah, it talks about God measuring the universe in the span of his hand. So imagine God holding everything in his hand, large and small, galaxies, universes, and then tiny atoms and small creatures. Things that are universal, things that are microscopic. He's holding them in the palm of his hand. And because God has all of life in the palm of his hands, they exist and they continue to exist. Then, Imagine one of us, one of those minuscule people that, just there's a speck of dust on his palm that he's upholding with his mighty power. Imagine one of those minuscule people that God is holding in his hand, attempting to hold the being of God in his or her hand. Wouldn't that be ludicrous? The God who holds universes together? But yet, I'm going to attempt to try to hold that being together? Do you see how absurd it is to think that God needs anything from his creation? He doesn't need us. He's independent of us. Think about Psalm 50 in verses 11 and 12. God says, I know all the birds of the hills, and all that moves in the field is mine. If I were hungry, I would not tell you, for the world and its fullness is mine. The God who possesses all things does not need the gifts of humanity, not even religious gifts. The opposite is true. We need God to come and to rescue us. So we need to be careful when we think about God. God alone cannot need. God alone cannot lack. God alone cannot be incomplete. A 17th century pastor wrote this: none ever in heaven or earth contributed to the least towards the maintenance or continuance of his being. Neither the creature's goodness nor their goods do him the least good. C.H. Spurgeon says this: we are too insignificant to be of any great importance in God's vast universe. He can do with us or without us, and our presence or absence will not disarrange. A.W. Tozer said, his interest in his creatures arises from his sovereign good pleasure, not from any need of those creatures that can supply, nor from any completeness they can bring to him who is complete in himself. God, the incomprehensible, is self-existent, and he is independent. Now, why does this matter? Why does this matter? Well, understanding why God does what he does is important. Consider two works of God. We're going to consider the first one, creation. And let's ask ourselves the question, why did God create? Well, one answer that's commonly given is that God needed someone with whom to share his life. He was lonely. But if God is self-sufficient, can loneliness or any other form of incompleteness be his reason for creating? The truth is more astonishing. So God didn't create you and I because he was lonely and he needed us. A lot of people think that. Why did God create? Well, let me read you a couple of quotes. Here's one. One commentator says, in eternity he was solitary, yet not lonely, complete in himself, his infinite fullness, and lacking nothing. He did not create from a sense of his own need, but from the overflow of his fullness. And he did not recreate, fallen man from any lack in himself. The fall of mankind did not lessen God. The rescue of a people has not added to his essential perfection. God does not need anyone or anything. So, God created from infinite fullness, not from any kind of lack. Listen to Paul Washer. He says to teach or even suggest that God made man because he was lonely or incomplete is a gross contradiction of the scriptures. God did not create the universe because he had a need, but because he desired to make known the superabundance of his perfections, glory, and goodness. Okay, why did God create? Didn't create because he was lonely. He created out of the superabundance of his perfections, glory, and goodness, to share those with us. Why did God redeem his enemies? Why did God save sinners. Well, again, some people think that God rescued our souls because he needs us. We imagine salvation as a two-way street, a mutually beneficial contract in which both parties benefit. Of course, we are quick to state that within this contract of salvation, we receive a great deal more than God does, yet we may secretly believe that he also needs something from us. Now, isn't that interesting? Yeah, God saved me because he was, he created me because he was lonely, and then he saved me because he needed me. And, God gets the better end of the deal, but he still gets something good when he saved me. When we understand God to be independent and self-existent and that he didn't need us, that in eternity past, he was fully sufficient and self-existent and fully loving and full of power and omnipotence and everything that God needed to be God. He was in himself and he didn't need us at all. That changes the way we think about God, and it changes the way we think about the created world around us. So strangely, the root issue here is not our definition of grace. It is our inadequate understanding of God, in particular our ignorance of his self-existence and self-sufficiency. We think of God as though he were a bigger version of us. We can be selfish and quick to help those who will help us in return, so we imagine God must be the same way. But we must not attribute our selfish ways of thinking to God because he isn't like us. We end up creating an idol of God when we think wrongly of him. So I want to talk about exposing a dual idolatry. Because idolatry comes in many forms. It's not just a statue in a closet you bow down to. How can we be guilty of making an idol of God by not understanding his self-sufficiency and his interdependence correctly? Well, the first way we can do that is attributing divine perfections to ourselves. We might call this the I am of human sin. There is a deeply rooted desire in all of us to be little gods. We want to live before our Maker as if we owe our existence to no one other than ourselves, as if we need nothing beyond what we can supply. We pretend that we exist by our own power and thus for our own pleasure. Now, I know none of you probably think that way, but sometimes we live for ourselves as if we exist for ourselves because we exist on our own power, our own ability, and thus we can live in whatever way we want. And we may not think that, but we live that way sometimes. And so we need to be careful to think about God correctly, that he doesn't need us. The exact opposite is we need him, that he didn't create us because he was lonely. He created us to need him and to do his will and to do his pleasure. So that's one of the ways that we can be guilty of creating an idol, is attributing divine perfections to ourselves, thinking we exist through our own strength, our own power, for our own purposes. The second way is failing to attribute these divine perfections to God in our practice. So failing to attribute God with self-existence and independence. What do we mean? Well, it is common to see people motivated to Christian service by the idea that God needs them in his kingdom work. God is depicted as a generous-hearted king who has made too many promises and is having trouble fulfilling all his obligations. What can he do? He paces the floor, wringing his hands. Then he stumbles upon an idea. I know, I'll enlist the people at Faith Baptist Church to help me out and get me out of my predicament. Tozer expounds on this, and he quote from Tozer. He says, thousands of young persons enter Christian service from no higher motive than to help deliver God from the embarrassing situation his love has gotten him into and his limited abilities seem unable to get him out of. The idea that God needs us, it's a pretty intoxicating one. God needs me. I'm pretty special. I need to help God out. Think of it, the Almighty needing you. Few things give people in modern churches a greater sense of worth than that idea, and yet it's a complete and total fabrication. It's a lie. If we're not careful, we will use this idolatrous view of God to help our church membership grow. Join our church. God needs people like you on his team. There's a kind of ministry for you around here. People join thinking that they are kindly helping God out, but what kind of God are they helping? Are they helping the God of the Bible or a God of their own imagination? Paul says this in Acts 17, the God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. God doesn't need you for anything. God is incomprehensibly great. He is self-existent and perfect in himself. He is the source of life and of power and of knowledge. He doesn't need us. But there is this incredible mystery talked about in the Bible, the mystery of being co-workers with the one who is self-sufficient. There is this paradox. The one person who depends upon nothing and no one, who supports all things and all people continually, has called us into the glorious labor of his kingdom. Paul says in 2 Corinthians 6:1 that we are working together with him. Then we appeal to you not to receive the grace of God in vain. We're co-laborers. We're fellow workers with God. So we need to keep two things in mind. First, God doesn't need us, but in his love and humility, he has chosen to involve us in his work. This, rather than the myth that God needs us, is the true foundation for the Christian sense of purpose. Second, no Christian in himself is sufficient for such labor. Paul speaks to this when he says that he labors and speaks on God's behalf, but the sufficiency he has in this work is not from himself, but in God. 2 Corinthians 3:5. Not that we are sufficient in ourselves to claim anything as coming from us, but our sufficiency is from God. What a profound mystery. The God who doesn't need anything has chosen by his grace to use us in his work, and we can't accomplish that work without him, yet he is the sufficiency that we need to accomplish his eternal redemptive plan. That is good news, folks. Why? This highlights God's grace. I'm not responsible to do God's job, but instead I'm graciously enabled to work for his glory and for his purpose. That's incredible. So consider these verses. Colossians 1:16. For by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him. Romans 11:36, for from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be glory forever. Amen. Yet for us there is one God, the Father, from whom are all things and for whom we exist. And one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom are all things and through whom we exist. One fundamental implication of God's independence and self-existence is that all which is not God is dependent upon him for existence. Each of us owes our existence to God's good pleasure. The biblical application of this is simple. We owe our all to the one who made us. David Brainerd says this, I have received my all from God. Oh, that I could return my all to God. Surely God is worthy of my highest affection and most devout adoration. He is infinitely worthy that I should make him my last end and live forever to him. Oh, that I might never more in any one instance live to myself. So as we conclude this study on the incomprehensibility of God, how should we wrap things up? God is incomprehensibly great. He is self-existent. He is independent of his creation. He alone is supreme and transcendent. Psalm 47 and verse 2 says, "For the Lord, the Most High, is to be feared, a great king over all the earth." God is Most High. And we must think of him this way. We must elevate our thinking as he reveals himself to be in his word. We must feel the weight of his majesty. He is transcendent. He is supreme. He is incomparable. He cannot be sufficiently compared to any one thing in his creation. Isaiah 40 and verse 25. "To whom then will you compare me that I should be like them, says the Holy One." He is solitary. That means he is in a category all his own. No one is in his category. He is alone in his perfections, unique, unequaled, unmatched, unrivaled, unparalleled. Deuteronomy 4:39, "Know therefore today and lay it to your heart that the Lord is God in heaven above and on the earth beneath. There is no other." How do we live in light of this? What should just be some of the things that should change the way we think, change the way we live, change the way we move and breathe, knowing that this incomprehensible, majestic God is the very God that we serve, that holds us together and from whom we find our life? Number one, if God is supreme, if he's all these things, if he's incomprehensibly supreme and solitary and incomparable and most high, then the Christian has been given a treasure beyond any other. Think about this. The Most High walked with a man, a creature made of dust in Eden. Later, the Most High sent his Son to accomplish a great rescue that would bring each Christian to know him in a vital, experiential relationship. The Most High sent his Spirit to indwell followers of Christ, making them his living temple. The most common Christian has been set apart by these distinguishing privileges. So, Christian, set your soul's deepest and strongest longings upon God Most High. The early church leader and theologian Augustine said this, "I desire to know God and my soul, nothing more, no, nothing at all." Psalm 91 and verse 9 says, "Because you have made the Lord your dwelling place, the Most High, who is my refuge." You realize that, Christian? The Most High, the incomprehensibly great, self-existent, independent, solitary God is your refuge and safe dwelling place. So we, like Augustine, should desire to say, "I desire to know God and nothing else." John Owen, I'm sorry, before we get to that quote by John Owen, I want to ask the question, what things in your life will need to change if you are going to know the Most High better? What will you need to remove from your life? If God indeed is your greatest treasure, are you really treasuring him, or are you treasuring something else? So what are you going to need to remove in your life so that God the Most High becomes your treasure? What are you going to have to add to your life so that God the Most High will be your treasure? Secondly, not only have we been given a treasure beyond any other, sin is correctly seen when we shine these truths into the dark corners of our lives. Sin is at the heart, taking the perfections of God and attributing them to yourself. So in this case, sin is saying that you, not God, are uniquely raised above all others. Your desires, your claims, your rights, your preferences, these are all higher than those of God's. And that is utterly wicked. That was the first sin. Isaiah 14 and verse 14, I will ascend, this is Satan, I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. Sin at its root is a desire to live as if you were the Most High, claiming all of his perfections and privileges. Consider the ways you have been living with the secret desire to claim the privileges of God. And then finally, what should we learn from this incomprehensible God? Number 3, what an only one is our Jesus. We know that Jesus of Nazareth is God and man united. This mystery is at the heart of all our hope as Christians. According to the angel, it was by the power of the Most High that it was accomplished. How greatly our appreciation for Jesus is increased when we apply these aspects of God to our Lord Jesus Christ. Jesus, being fully God, is incomprehensible. He is transcendent, rising as the Most High above all creation in every aspect of his divine nature. Jesus is incomparable in his dignity, for he is solitary in his divine perfections. You have the opportunity to look long and to stare hard at Jesus Christ and to see his glory and to be changed from one degree of glory into the next, as you feel the weight of the majesty of the God who is incomprehensible. And I trust that you will do exactly that. Again, that hymn that we sang the other day comes to mind by Edward Coswell. O Jesus, light of all below, thou fount of life and fire, surpassing all the joys we know and all we can desire. So I hope this is a help to you. I hope you will dwell long and deep and hard on the idea of God's majesty, that it is incomprehensible. It cannot be fully understood. You will spend the eons learning more and more about the greatness and the majesty of our God. Cause that to be so in your life this week, in your mind and in your living, all for his glory, for he truly deserves it. Until next week, have a wonderful day. See you next time. Bye-bye.